Another group of athletes are going to the CrossFit Games. Thanks for joining us today for our daily semifinal recap show. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. Ed Haynes is here with me after yet another exciting day as 4 athletes and 2 teams punched their tickets to Madison this summer. Ed, no real surprises at the top of the leaderboards, and the programming, it panned out in their favor from yesterday into today.
Yeah, we said that day 3 would be moving day in the Far East, but actually there was really no moving in the top 2. Those positions stayed as they were yesterday. Still some really good battles that played out over the events today. But what we did see in terms of moving was change-ups in the battle for the Last Chance Qualifier. So every semi-final gives 3 spots to the next 3 people outside of the qualifiers. So here in the men's and women's, that's basically 3rd through to 5th. Lots of change-ups there, so that's quite exciting. But yeah, as you said, Lauren, top 2 in the men's and the women's and the teams stayed as they were from yesterday.
I mean, even when you look at Roman's times, yesterday we talked about how he's a little bit in a league of his own, but that there's these other athletes that were fighting for that second place position. How much momentum does this give somebody like Roman, who's finally, hopefully, we're going to see him back in the States in Madison this summer?
Yeah, definitely. So it was an interesting interview after he had wrapped up first place, and they had asked him, firstly, what does this mean for you going to CrossFit Games? And, how do you think you're going to do at the CrossFit Games? And Roman was answering in Russian, and there was a translator after. So you're kind of sitting in anticipation. And I haven't really heard Roman in interviews all that much. So I wasn't really sure if he was going to take kind of like the humble route or he's going to take the confident route, the arrogant route. Wasn't really sure. But, he said, which I actually loved, like, I'm going to CrossFit Games and I'm 100% going to win the CrossFit Games. There is absolutely no doubt that I'm going there to win. It's going to happen. And I thought, wow, because, you hear about so many great athletes who are, repeated champions, and they, the way they talk about winning is kind of like that. So I actually really loved hearing that. It kind of reminded me of Matt Fraser in the way that he talked about, competition and how important winning was. And they also talked about, asked him, what does this mean in terms of your preparation now for CrossFit Games? And he had said, well, for the last, this is now, I think, the 5th time he's qualified for the games. And this is the best chance he's ever going to have because, he's actually been in the US. He's got a visa already. And he said, actually, in the last 5 years, even though he hasn't obviously made it to the games because of visa issues, he's always trained as if he was going. So this is just going to be another year. So, the momentum rolling out of this competition, he did have some stiff competition. He did have some dominant performances, but the level is going to be a tremendous step up when the CrossFit Games rolls around. You're going to have a field of 30 plus athletes of very, very high quality. Whereas in Asia, this was a battle between 3 people for the whole weekend. So it's going to be a new challenge for sure.
Sure. Tell us more about that battle between Nazar and Semenov, especially with how the programming obviously played out in Nazar's favor ultimately.
Yeah, they're actually 2 very similar athletes. I've talked about this all weekend, but similar in stature, similar in size, both excelled in the strength events. And when we have a strength bias programming, really the separator was that event 5, which was the only non-heavy event we saw of all the 6 events, really. And to be honest, like, I wasn't really sure how either were going to do. I thought that this would be a good opportunity for maybe smaller and more aerobic athletes to kind of move up into the top 3 and 5 in that event and perhaps shake up that leaderboard a little bit. But actually, when you look at, this is the Far East chipper, NASA took 3rd, and he looked really composed, executed a pacing plan very, very well. Roman was, again, he was the only athlete to break 13. And then Semenov, this is where he dropped off. And essentially, Semenov not being able to hang with NASA in the top 3 is where basically NASA went into that last event with a bit of a lead. So going into that very last event, there was a 20-point spread between Roman and NASA, and then there was a 20-point spread between NASA and Semenov. So 20 points doesn't sound like all that much, and it sounds like that could be lost in one event. But again, when the battle was only really taking place between 4 to 5 athletes, they're pretty much secure. Or it took, unless NASA just had a real issue with that last event because there were some weird movements. There was dumbbell deadlifts and a lot of repetitions. Then there was walking lunges, and you never know how an athlete's going to go walking lunges. We do know that because he's big and he's tall, and you're lunging for distance, it helps when you're a taller athlete because each stride is covering more ground. But as soon as he started moving in 2 lunges, I knew that no, he's got second place wrapped up.
And I mean, they're both going to the CrossFit Games. As for those athletes going to the Last Chance Qualifier on the men's side, that's really where we've seen a lot of shifting in the leaderboard throughout the weekend.
Yeah. So the biggest name who jumped back into contention for the Last Chance Qualifier is Ed Haynes, actually my brother and my athlete. So I'm stoked to see him up there. So Ant had
Congratulations.
Thank you, and congratulations, Ant. But he had a tough day 1. Things didn't quite go as planned, and was basically, it was just a matter of climbing and just staying in the zone and trying to give the performance that he knows he's capable of. It was a shame because he actually moved into a top heat placing going into that last event, and you kind of want, when in a competition, you kind of want the top 7 or top 8, depending on how many lanes there are, to kind of be vying neck and neck in that last event.
That's where you see the competitive nature between them.
The competitive nature, and it has a real impact on times because you're putting all the fastest, fittest individuals in one heat, but that actually wasn't reshuffling in the last heat. So it'd be interesting to see if that might have changed some of the results there. But anyway, congrats to him. Semenov and Fedotov, they hung in the 3rd and 4th place all weekend. But cool to see, Ant jumping up and taking that last spot in the Last Chance Qualifier.
Yeah. How excited are you for him?
Oh, very, very excited. I mean, we'll have to debrief because the Last Chance Qualifier, that's essentially the hardest competition of them all because you've just got so many really, really good athletes all vying for one spot. Exactly. You're taking out the element of live competition because people get to do it in their gyms. And some athletes compete better in an arena-based competition. Some athletes compete better in their home gym setting. So yeah, it's going to be tough. It's definitely, it's great that athletes get this next chance to make it. But for many, many athletes, they will know that their chance to make it to the games would have been this weekend or in that competition. And, we'll see what happens.
Yeah, the Last Chance Qualifier is going to be stacked anyway. You cut the pie for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's move on now to the women's field. Again, the 2 women who we've seen at the top of the leaderboard all weekend long, they were able to hold those spaces. But then again, the Last Chance Qualifier, that's where some of the shift up started to happen.
Yeah. So on day 1 and day 2, we've been talking about Choi, who dominated every single event. I think she finished first in all 4 of the first 4 events. But the last day was all about Seher Kaya from Turkey, and she dominated actually both the events. She put a really good time and took first place in the chipper, and she raced through in her dumbbell deadlifts and just set a lead from the start in the final event, and just no one could catch her. So really cool to see her, solidifying a really solid second place and looking really good in this last day. There was lots of change ups. When you look at 3rd to 5th, we had Shahad Budebs. She was kind of in that top 5 all weekend. Unfortunately, just one bad event on that final one, and she dropped out of it. And you can kind of look at the scores of those kind of top 5, especially 3 to 5. Like they're always finishing kind of in the
very
the
consistent
3 to 7, 3 to 8. Yeah, just consistency is the name of the game. And so big change ups on that last event. Daewon Jung, who also trains at the same gym as Choi, they went on a team together in Wadapalooza, and she is a very proficient athlete. I just think a lot younger in the sport of CrossFit, but from a physical capacity standpoint, like definitely has what it takes. She had a really, really big last day as well, taking a 2nd place and a 3rd place, and she just kind of jumped up the leaderboard, took the 3rd spot on the podium, which is always great to finish on the podium, although unfortunately it doesn't really mean that much in the Far East Throwdown because it's all about the top 2. But really cool as well, Yuka Sakayama, she has been in the game forever. And, so many people just look at Yuka and, she's not built your typical CrossFitter. She's very small in stature, but a very, very, very capable athlete. It's so cool that she is still competing at this level, still in the mix, still qualifying, still doing really well. So yeah, just massive congratulations to Yuko for still being in the game and climbing up there. And I do think people like Dema Zebde, I think she's just like a really great ambassador for the sport as well. It's cool to see her and Shahad like out there on a competition floor and just crushing it.
What was it like seeing some of these women, like, as they were approaching the podium during the ceremony at the end? And, like, what was the fan reaction? Could you tell that people knew that these were gonna be the women who ultimately would stand on the podium or go to the CrossFit Games?
Yeah, I definitely think it was cool because the competition's in Korea, and where it was in Korea, Busan it's not the capital. It's actually quite a trek to get out there, and so the majority of the spectators and fans were locals who had just come down to support. So you could see all weekend, every time there was a Korean competing, the crowd was going wild, and that's always awesome because even though the crowd's not cheering for you sometimes, just you can feed off that as an athlete. And it just makes the experience so much better. So it was really cool to see both Choi and Jung on the podium, two Koreans, and both who had really dominant last days. So I definitely think that the crowd was stoked to see two of their locals performing so well. But I do think it was everyone kind of knew coming into this competition that Choi was definitely the favorite. Again, she did really well last year, made it to the games, and actually put in a lot of respectable performances at the CrossFit Games. So, and she looked really solid this year. Today was the first time that she'd placed outside of first place, and so that's very respectable. When you place outside of first and you're still finishing third and second, it's still not too shabby. So, yeah,
Not a bad way to end the weekend.
Exactly.
And then finally, moving on to the teams division. Again, the two teams that you've been talking about all weekend at the top going to the CrossFit Games, Khrennikov and Yaz Black.
Yeah, so the two events today, we were talking about today being potentially an interesting day because what we've seen in day one and day two is like we've always talked about, individual-based events. There wasn't much teamwork involved. So basically, your individuals in your team, if they were proficient, if they were capable, you're probably going to do well as a team. The first workout today was actually a partner chipper, so male pairings and female pairings, and so there was a synchronization aspect, definitely like a pacing element, a strategy element. But Kalashnikov still in that event still came out on top. Unfortunately, no one finished that event. It's always nice to see some teams finishing an event. When you know that every athlete doesn't finish, then perhaps maybe the time cap needs to be revisited, or maybe the load was a bit too much, or whatever it was. But anyway, Kalashnikov took first place in that one, and then I think it was nice, even though they dominated the whole weekend, it was nice for someone else to win an event. And in the very last event, which we saw the worm come out, CrossFit Aliyah, who unfortunately kind of going into that last event probably knew already there was no chance really that they were going to climb into a qualifying spot. But with that said, knowing that you can't qualify, but still going out there and putting out a really solid, gutsy performance, because it was a pretty brutal workout on the worm, and taking first place, I think that was nice for them to kind of, take an event win at some point in the weekend. But unfortunately, the point spread was just too much going into that event. And, Yaz Black and Kalashnikov pretty much knew like this is theirs for taking now.
Yeah, and even though they weren't enough points to get that ticket to the games, watching teams with the worm, that is so different than any other movements they do, especially like a lot of teams don't have a worm at their at their affiliate. They're not always training with it. It is so interesting to see how the communication pans out with teams once they get to that worm.
Yeah, and I do love the worm as a facet of team competition. Because it does really require synchronization. It requires really good teamwork. Requires really great communication. You also need to factor in like height of your athletes. We know that like looking at Kalashnikov, they had one big male who kind of stuck out a little bit, but he was super strong. He was super dominant on the snatch ladder as well. So, it's okay for a big athlete if they're capable to take on the extra load. But there's just so many things you have to think about as a team when there's worm workouts. And I think I would have really liked to see a bit more worm work brought into this competition, this event. But yeah, again, like the individual teams that was so good in events 1 to 4 were still good in the worm as well. So yeah.
When you look at the weekend as a whole, what were some of the highlights for you, Ed, as you were a spectator?
I mean, the thing that I think about the most when I think about this weekend is just the men's division. And again, I know I've talked about this all weekend, but just that battle between the three big gentlemen, Roman, Nasser, and Arthur, and just they're great. Yes, they're big, and when you see a big individual, you just assume they're going to be good at the heavy stuff. But these athletes actually surprised me in more than one way. Event 5 in the chipper, beating very high level athletes who've been in the sport for a really long time, moving with really good technique, moving with really good efficiency. I think just that battle between the three is something I'll always think about. And I guess the thing I'm also going to think about is be interesting to see, not Roman, but to see what Nasser is like when he gets to the CrossFit Games. We didn't see that much breadth in terms of tests at the Far East Throwdown. So when things like swimming come in, really long distance running events, there's going to be some heavy stuff that he's going to enjoy, he's going to do well. And I'm just really excited to see him, in that lineup on the beach, ready to roll, or at the lake, ready to swim.
He doesn't need to wear neon or anything. We will be able to see him.
you will spot NASA. So yeah, just really cool. And it's always nice to have new names at the CrossFit Games. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, to have him there and experiencing it, I think it's great. And for someone he's representing Q8, you never know what that does and what ripple effect that has to the local community. Yesterday you asked me, perhaps what is holding back Asia? Like, how do we get more people in the sport? And I do think idols are super important. Idols maybe don't have an impact on the affiliate level and people training in affiliates, but they do have an impact on people wanting to pursue the sport. And, someone like Choi has been a massive ambassador, for Korean women. And Korean women now, you're seeing it amongst the teams, there's lots of really good athletes coming through. What's this going to do now that NASA's now competing at CrossFit Game? Is that now going to have a ripple effect on the Middle East? Because we know the Middle East, there are lots of CrossFit gyms. There are lots of people doing CrossFit, but there's a difference between doing CrossFit in your affiliate and pursuing something like the CrossFit Games. So it'll be interesting to see if that has a ripple effect. And then, if someone like him can stay as a perennial CrossFit Games athlete and make it year after year, well, then that's what you'll see, I think, real impact.
And that's what we're trying to do, grow the sport in other areas. And this could just be one avenue to do it.
Exactly.
Ed, this has been such a fun weekend. Thank you so much for doing all these recap shows with us. The audience loves you. Morning Chalk Up loves you. You are so intelligent and you really brought us all up to speed every day. And we appreciate it more than we can express.
Lauren, I really, really appreciate that. And I also want to just return my gratitude to say, this was such a cool opportunity. I really appreciate you guys reaching out to me. I've absolutely loved it. This is, I'm just such a fan of the sport, and being able to actually share that with people and have this great conversation with you has been awesome. So thank you so much to you and the Morning Chalk Up team.
Thank you. We will be in touch, and fans, we're going to have Ed on more. So stay tuned.
Awesome. See you guys.